Picture this. A mansion on Chicago's Gold Coast. Floor-to-ceiling windows catch the last light of a winter evening. And inside, in a room filled with the most expensive furniture money could buy, a 6-year-old girl sits alone by the window, holding a small gold locket against her chest, and says absolutely nothing. Not a word. Not a whisper. Not even a sound. Her name is Louissa Kwon, and she has not spoken a single word in 2 years. Not to the 7 therapists her father brought in. Not to the 3 nannies who tried with every kind heart they had. Not to the music therapist who played the most beautiful songs in the softest voice. Not even to the little girl down the street who knocked on the iron gate once and held up a drawing of a butterfly just to make her smile. Louissa had smiled. She had pressed her little palm flat against the window glass. But she had not spoken. Because 2 years ago Louissa lost her mother. And somewhere in the quiet space between then and now, her voice had decided it was safer, kinder, to simply disappear. And then there is her father. Tae-Min Kwon. A man the business world describes in carefully chosen words. Formidable. Precise. Untouchable. A man who built an international trade and fine art empire from the ground up, who sits at the heads of boardroom tables and speaks in a voice so calm it makes rooms go still. A man who, every single night without exception, sits beside his daughter's bed, opens a picture book, and reads to her in a voice so gentle you would not recognize it as the same man. He does not know if she listens. He reads anyway, because she is the whole world. And the whole world has gone quiet. And he does not know how to fix it. And that is the part that is breaking him, slowly, quietly, the way ice breaks in early spring, the realization that all his power, all his resources, all his empire, cannot give his little girl back her voice. But one evening, one perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening in February, Tae-Min decides to try something different. No specialists, no sessions, no careful plans. Just dinner. Just the 2 of them. A small table in a candlelit Italian restaurant. Normal. Simple. Human. And that is when she walks in. A young woman with freckles across her nose and paint still faintly staining the side of her left hand. A woman with kind hazel eyes and a smile that somehow, feels like it was made specifically to be warm in exactly the way this little girl needed. Her name is Nia Hayes. And she is just a server. Just a woman working double shifts to pay for art school, carrying plates of pasta and baskets of bread, doing a job she is grateful for, even if it is not the whole dream. She does not know who this man is. She does not know why this beautiful little girl with the golden locket and the tight natural curls will not look up from the tablecloth. She only knows, in the way that deeply feeling people always somehow know, that something in this moment matters. So she kneels down. She speaks gently. She mentions the locket. And Louissa Kwon, silent for 2 years, looks up. And whispers one word. One word. And 3 hearts will never be the same again. This is a story about the healing that hides in unexpected places. About a father learning to let someone in. About a little girl finding her voice in the presence of love. And about a woman who almost stopped believing in beautiful things, until beautiful things came looking for her. Stay with us. This one is going to make you feel everything. Hey everyone, where are you watching from right now? And if a silent little girl suddenly whispered one word to you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments below. The Gold Coast mansion was the kind of home that made people slow their cars as they drove past. 3 stories of pale limestone and dark iron, set back from the street behind a low hedge of sculpted boxwood. In summer, climbing roses would thread through the iron fence and bloom in a wash of deep pink. In February, they were bare, elegant in their nakedness, like everything else about the Kwon household, composed, restrained, and quietly magnificent. Inside, the rooms were warm in the way that professionally designed spaces sometimes are, technically warm. Heated to the correct temperature. Lit with tasteful amber light. Arranged with perfectly placed art on the walls. Original pieces, each one chosen with care, because Tae-Min Kwon understood beauty even when he struggled to feel it. The living room on the first floor had a grand piano that no one played anymore. A library on the second floor held thousands of books, and Tae-Min had read perhaps a quarter of them in the 2 years since the house had gone quiet. The kitchen, all marble countertops and professional-grade appliances, smelled each evening of whatever Mrs. Yoon, the housekeeper, had prepared, something always careful and nourishing and slightly more elaborate than necessary, because Mrs. Yoon expressed love through broth and braised meats and small dishes of cut fruit set beside glasses of warm milk. And at the center of all of it, at the heart of this beautiful, aching house, was a 6-year-old girl named Louissa. She was a remarkable child to look at. Anyone who saw her said so immediately, and not in the empty way people compliment children to be polite, but with genuine startled wonder. Her rich brown skin and her father's sharp, fine-boned structure softened into something rounder and more luminous. Tight natural curls gathered up with ribbons in whatever color matched the day's mood. Today it was pale yellow, because she had pointed at the yellow ribbon on the dresser this morning, and her nanny, Miss Park, had tied them carefully into 2 puffs at the top of her head. Bright dark eyes, enormous and watchful and ancient in the way that children who have known grief often are. As if they have already seen things that most eyes take decades to see. Around her neck always was the locket. Gold. Small. The size of a large coin. Shaped like a heart. Inside it, if you could convince Louissa to open it, which you rarely could, was a tiny photograph. A woman laughing, her head thrown back, her arms wrapped around a smaller Louissa, both of them blurred slightly from motion and joy. Louissa touched the locket constantly. When she was anxious, a flat palm pressed to it. When she was thinking, turning it slowly between 2 fingers. When she was sad, both hands cupped around it, like she was keeping a small flame alive. She had not spoken since the accident. The therapists called it selective mutism compounded by an acute grief response. They said it with the careful authority of people who know the name of a thing but not quite the thing itself. Tae-Min had sat through 7 of them. He had taken careful notes in a small leather notebook. He had implemented every suggestion, purchased every recommended workbook and downloaded every app. He had restructured his schedule to be home by 5 every evening. He had turned the sunroom into a play space with every color of paint and every size of sketchbook and a collection of small clay pots that Louissa liked to hold. Nothing precisely had worked, which is not to say nothing had happened. Louissa was not unhappy, or at least not in the brittle, dangerous way Tae-Min feared most in the early months. She smiled. Not often but genuinely the smiles arrived like small, surprising gifts. She loved to draw. She filled sketchbook after sketchbook with careful, surprisingly detailed drawings. Houses, trees, birds, faces, flowers, patterns that repeated and branched in intricate cascades across the page. She loved it when Mrs. Yoon made kimchi pancakes for breakfast. She loved the family of sparrows that nested in the garden's old oak tree every spring, and had already begun checking, with careful daily surveillance from her window, for any signs of their early return. She communicated. Just not with words. She had developed her own precise lexicon of gesture. A nod for yes, a small shake for no, a specific 2-fingered point for I want that, an open palm held up for stop or wait, a tug on the sleeve for come with me. She drew pictures to express complex thoughts. She had once drawn, with detailed accuracy, a picture of a cracked cup to express that something was broken in a way she could not describe, and Tae-Min had held that drawing for a long time after she gave it to him. She was in there. Fully, wholly, luminously in there. That was never the question. The question was only the silence. And whether someday, somehow, it might end. Tae-Min's own days were precise. He was up at 5:30 regardless of the season. He dressed immaculately. He had never in any of his adult life been anything other than immaculate, in tailored suits in dark colors, charcoal and navy and deepest green, always with a pocket square, always with shoes that held a quiet, careful shine. He was tall, with the kind of lean, controlled build that spoke of discipline rather than effort, and he moved through rooms the way water moves through channels, deliberately without waste. His features were sharp and Korean and severe in repose, the kind of face that people in boardrooms read as cold because it was so perfectly still. But his eyes, if you caught them at the right angle, in the right light, held something entirely different. Something open and old and hurting. He ran his empire, Kwon International, a trade and fine art company spanning galleries and shipping routes across Seoul, New York, London and Chicago, from a home office on the 2nd floor between 7 and 3, when Mrs. Yoon picked Louissa up from her small private school. He was a brilliant businessman, thorough and fair, respected by everyone who worked for him. His assistant, Jiho, had worked for him for 9 years and still said he was the most intelligent person she had ever encountered. But none of that mattered at 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, Tae-Min Kwon closed his laptop, put away his phone, went downstairs and became someone else entirely. He became a father. He would sit on the floor of the sunroom with Louissa and look at her drawings. He would help Mrs. Yoon set the table and pour Louissa's milk with the exact amount of warmth she preferred, tested carefully because she had once gently pushed a glass back toward him to indicate it wasn't quite right. He would eat dinner across from her and tell her small things about his day, not requiring responses, just talking the way you keep a lamp lit, not because you need the light in that moment but because darkness is worse. And then at bedtime he would sit beside her and read. Tonight it was The Snowy Day, a book with worn corners they had read perhaps 40 times together. Louissa lay with her head on the pillow, both hands wrapped around the locket the way she always did at the day's end, and Tae-Min read in a low, even voice, one hand resting near hers on the blanket without touching, available but not demanding. When he finished, she looked at him. Her enormous eyes were studying his face with that careful, searching attention she gave to everything important. He looked back at her steadily, giving her the full gift of his attention. He smiled softly. "Good night, Lou," he said as he always did. She lifted her hand and touched his cheek just once, briefly. The pad of her small fingers against the line of his jaw. Then she closed her eyes. Tae-Min sat for a moment in the quiet room, her small breathing the only sound. Then he stood, turned off the lamp and walked to the hallway, and stood there for a moment with his hand still on the doorframe, the way a person stands when they are trying to hold something together and not quite sure how much longer they can manage it. He had tried everything the world of expertise had to offer. Tomorrow he decided he would try something else. Something simple. Something human. Memory is not always kind. But sometimes it is generous. There are mornings, not many but some, when Tae-Min wakes and for exactly 3 seconds before consciousness fully assembles itself he forgets. He forgets the quiet house. He forgets the empty side of the bed. He forgets that the laugh that used to ring through these rooms like music has been absent for 2 years. And in those 3 seconds he is simply awake and the world is still whole. Then the 4th second arrives. And he remembers. Her name had been Amara. Amara Kwon Neo Se Mensa. 32 years old when they lost her. Originally from Accra, raised partly in London, arrived in Chicago for a landscape architecture fellowship, and met Tae-Min at a gallery opening where she had looked at a bronze sculpture for so long without moving that he had gone to stand beside her just to understand what she was seeing. She glanced at him sideways, this small, composed man in his dark suit, and said, "It looks like it's about to start running. Don't you think?" And then she had smiled and Tae-Min, who did not, as a rule, smile easily at anything, had smiled back. She was warm and loud and deeply funny and entirely unimpressed by wealth, which he had found so disorienting at first that he had kept testing it, expecting her to eventually reveal a hidden agenda, and she never had. She had warm brown skin and a natural radiance that photographers tried to capture and never quite got. She sang while she cooked, loudly and off-key and with absolute conviction. She filled every room she entered with a specific quality of aliveness that made the room feel larger. And she had loved Louissa with a ferociousness that still, when Tae-Min allowed himself to think about it, made his chest ache in a specific way that had no name. She had called Louissa Little Lightning. She had braided her curls every morning while Louissa sat on the bathroom counter, swinging her feet and chatting with breathless animation about everything. Her dreams, the birds outside, what she thought clouds were made of, and whether butterflies remembered being caterpillars. They had been the same, those two, both of them incandescent, both of them filling the world with color and noise and warm, unstoppable life. The accident had occurred in winter. A road made treacherous by black ice, an oncoming car that crossed the center line at the worst possible moment. Amara had not survived. Louissa, buckled in safely in the back seat, physically unharmed, had been pulled from the wreckage by a paramedic who said later, in his report, that the little girl had looked at him with enormous eyes but had not made a single sound. She had not made a sound since. The grief specialist had been patient and thorough. The first had worked with Louissa for 4 months, using play therapy and gentle art exercises, and reported significant progress in nonverbal expression before Louissa had simply stopped engaging with her, not hostilely, but with the quiet finality of someone who has decided a room holds nothing more for them. The second had tried a different approach, more structured, and Louissa had sat through it with polite, distant stillness. The third had specialized in childhood trauma and came highly recommended, and Louissa had drawn her a picture of a door, closed, on the first session, and had repeated the same drawing on every subsequent session until they both understood what she was saying. The fourth, fifth, and sixth had produced small warmths, a wider smile here, a more spontaneous drawing there, moments of genuine connection that kindled hope and then settled into a plateau. The seventh, a music therapist named Ms. Raines, whom Louissa had genuinely seemed to like, had brought something close to a breakthrough. Louissa had hummed. Just once, just 3 notes, following Ms. Raines' melody in the sunroom on a Thursday afternoon. She had not done it again. But she had hummed. That memory sustained Tae-Min through many long evenings. The voice was still in there. It had not gone forever. It was only waiting, biding its time with the patient, self-preserving wisdom of a child who has learned that speaking costs something, and who has not yet found a person worth that cost. He understood this. He had read enough, spoken with enough specialists, sat with his own quiet grief enough in the small hours of the night, to understand the shape of his daughter's silence. It was not permanent. It was protective. It was her way of holding herself together until she felt safe enough to let sound back into the world. What she needed, the best of the specialists had told him gently, was not a technique. Not a methodology. Not a structured intervention. What she needed was simply to encounter something that made her feel that the world outside her silence was worth returning to. You cannot plan that, the specialist had said, and Tae-Min, a man whose life was built on planning, had found this both the most frustrating and the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 2 years. You cannot plan it. You can only be ready when it comes. That thought was with him the morning after reading The Snowy Day, when he sat in his home office and found himself staring at the photograph on his desk. Himself and Amara and Louissa at a beach somewhere, all three of them sunbright and ridiculous, Amara holding Louissa upside down while Louissa shrieked with delight, and made a quiet, small decision. No more planning. Just life. Just normal, ordinary, beautiful life. He picked up his phone and called Jiho. "Reserve Lumina for tonight," he said. "The private alcove. Just for 2. Jiho said gently, "Are you sure, sir?" "It's a Tuesday." It was always gentle with Jiho. She had been his assistant long enough to know when to push back and when to simply confirm, and she had mastered a particular tone, professional, warm, carefully not pitying, that Tae-Min appreciated more than he would ever say out loud. "I'm sure," he said. 7 o'clock. He spent the rest of the workday in his usual way, calls with the London office, a review of acquisition proposals for a gallery in Gangnam, a lengthy email chain about a shipping dispute that his legal team would handle but that he preferred to read himself. He was thorough in everything. His father had built the first iteration of Kwon International from nothing, with hands and will and a ferocious belief that beauty, real beauty, the kind housed in great art, was not only for the wealthy, and Tae-Min had expanded it with the same principle, that beautiful things had value, and that value deserved to be handled with care. He believed in care. He believed in it with the quiet intensity of a man who has organized his entire life around it. And yet, there was a specific kind of helplessness that not even the most careful, devoted father can reason his way out of. It lives in the gap between I would do anything and I don't know what to do. It is the helplessness of watching your child carry a weight you cannot lift for her, of sitting beside her bed and reading picture books and hoping, always hoping, that the warmth of your presence is somehow, in ways invisible to you, doing something. Filling something. Holding something together that might otherwise come apart. Tae-Min knew this helplessness well. He had made his peace with it, or tried to. He was not a man who surrendered to things he couldn't control. But over 2 years he had learned the particular art of holding on while letting go, staying completely present for Louissa while releasing his need for a specific outcome, trusting that the love was landing even when he couldn't see it. So, there were evenings. There were evenings when the house was so quiet that every clock in it seemed to tick louder than necessary, and Tae-Min would pour himself a single glass of whiskey and stand by the window in the library and watch the street below and feel the full, unguarded weight of this is not how it was supposed to be. Not in bitterness, he was not a bitter man, but in the pure, clean ache of grief that has nowhere to go and simply has to be sat with, like a difficult guest who will eventually leave. He missed Amara with the specific pain of someone who has lost not just a person but a whole version of the world. The world with her in it had been more vivid, more textured, more alive. He had not known that until she was gone. It is one of grief's cruelest tricks. It teaches you, retroactively, exactly what you had. He was lonely. He would not say so because he was not the kind of man who said things like that, and because saying it aloud would make it loud in a way he wasn't ready for. But he was. Deeply, carefully, quietly lonely. Not for just anyone. For someone who could sit in this house and make it feel inhabited again. Someone with warmth in their hands and patience in their eyes, and the specific courage it takes to love a grieving child who cannot tell you what she needs. He did not think about this consciously. He had not permitted himself to think about it. There was too much else to hold. But somewhere beneath the plans and the boardroom composure and the bedtime readings, the loneliness lived in him like a quiet, patient thing waiting. At 3:30 Mrs. Yoon brought Louissa home from school. Louissa came through the front door in her small navy coat and yellow ribbons, backpack over one shoulder, and immediately turned toward the staircase. Then she paused, turned, looked at Tae-Min, who had come into the hallway at the sound of the door. He crouched to her level, he always crouched, he never loomed, and said, "Hi Lou." She looked at him. "Would you like to go out to dinner tonight? Somewhere nice. Just us." A long pause. Her eyes were moving across his face with that careful, reading attention. Then slowly a nod. Tae-Min exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. "I thought you might like that." She turned and went upstairs. And if Tae-Min stood in the hallway for a moment with a feeling in his chest that was a complicated mixture of hope and terror, well, that was between him and the quiet house. Lumina occupied the ground floor of a brownstone 2 blocks from the lakefront, and it was the kind of restaurant that did not need to advertise. Its entrance was a single dark green door with a small brass plaque, no sign beyond the name in restrained lettering. Inside, the lighting was the warm amber of old beeswax candles, and in fact many of the candles were real, clustered on tables and mismatched glass holders, casting pools of moving warmth across white linen and dark wood. The menu was small and handwritten. The bread came hot from the kitchen in a cloth-lined basket with a small ceramic pot of herb butter. The pastas were made that afternoon. The room held only 9 tables and on any given night, it was full. Kwon International quietly held an investment stake in the restaurant, one of several local culinary ventures Tae-Min had backed over the years, believing in the particular city-level grace of a neighborhood restaurant done perfectly, and Mateo, the maitre d', greeted him at the door with the warmth of long familiarity. "Mr. Kwon," he said, and then looking down with a gentled voice, "Miss Louissa, good evening." Louissa looked up at Mateo. Then she looked at the room, taking it all in with those wide measuring eyes, the way she always took in new spaces, carefully, cataloging, deciding. The private alcove was at the back. A curved booth of soft burgundy leather, half enclosed by a low wooden partition hung with trailing ivy, creating a small, gentle world within the larger room. The table held 2 white candles, a small vase with 3 pale pink roses, and a bread basket already set out. Mateo had known because Mateo always knew. Tae-Min helped Louissa with her coat and settled her into the booth. She slid in and immediately pressed herself into the corner, back to the wall, her preferred position in any space, where she could see the room without being in the middle of it. She set her small bag beside her. Her hand went, as it always did within the first moments of anywhere new, to the locket at her neck. Tae-Min sat across from her. The restaurant hummed with quiet evening warmth around them. At a nearby table, a couple spoke in low voices, leaning slightly toward each other. Elsewhere, a family of 4, a woman reading alone with a glass of red wine. The gentle percussion of kitchen sounds drifted through from somewhere beyond. Soft music played at a volume chosen specifically to feel like part of the air. Louissa looked at everything. Then she looked at the candle on their table. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, something in it softening, the way it did when something genuinely pleased her. She watched the flame for a long moment, her face lit from below in warm gold. Tae-Min watched her watching the candle. "Should we look at the menu?" he said quietly. She turned her gaze to the small handwritten card on the table, scanning it with great seriousness. She pointed, 2 fingers deliberate, to the pasta with butter and sage. "Good choice," he said. She pointed to the warm chocolate cake at the bottom of the dessert menu. "Also a good choice," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. She looked at him and something in her eyes glinted. It might have been amusement. They sat in their particular, practiced, companionable quiet, the quiet they had built together over 2 years, the quiet that was not empty but full of the small language they had made between them, and the evening felt, for the first time in a long time, almost normal. Almost like a father and daughter at dinner. Tae-Min's shoulders, without his consciously directing them to do so, dropped by approximately 1 inch. He unfolded his menu. And then the door to the kitchen swung open and their server came out. She had paint on her hand. It was the first thing Tae-Min noticed, not because it was remarkable but because it was unexpected in this context. A small smear of cadmium yellow on the outer edge of her left palm, just below the pinky finger, the kind of mark that settles into skin and stays even after washing because the pigment is stubborn. She was carrying 2 glasses of water and a small dish of olives on a tray, and she moved through the room with the particular ease of someone who has learned to carry things carefully without looking like they're being careful. She wore the restaurant's simple uniform, white shirt, black apron, with her natural curls pulled back loosely, a few escaping around her face. Warm brown skin and freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose like a constellation somebody had mapped with affection. Hazel eyes that were, even from across the room, striking. The kind of eyes that seemed to be permanently engaged, permanently interested. She was not the most beautiful woman in the room in any conventional way. She was something more specific than that. She was immediately warm. The way a room is warm when someone has recently baked bread in it. The warmth arrived before she did, almost. She reached the alcove and set down the water glasses with practiced efficiency, then glanced up and smiled. A genuine smile, not the performance of one. "Good evening," she said. "Welcome to Lumina. I'm Nia. I'll be taking care of you tonight." A brief beat. Have you both been before? Tae-Min said, yes. Then because it felt relevant, but it's her first time. Nia looked at Louissa. And here was the thing that Tae-Min noticed immediately, that he would think about later with quiet wonder. She did not look at Louissa the way most adults looked at children, which is to say slightly over them, aiming the interaction primarily at the parent. She looked at Louissa. Directly. With the full, unhurried gift of her attention. First time, Nia said softly. That's special. What do you think so far? Louissa was watching her. Not with her usual retreat into stillness, but with something more alert, the way she watched the sparrows when they first returned in spring. Watchful and ready. She did not respond. Nia didn't fill the silence with anything. Didn't rush in with reassuring noise. She simply waited, comfortably, as if she had all the time there was. Then her eyes dropped, just briefly, naturally, to the locket. That is beautiful, she said softly. Not to Tae-Min. To Louissa. Is that a heart? Pause. Then, the tiniest of nods. It looks like it's made of real gold, Nia said. Very special. Someone must love you very much to give you something like that. Louissa's fingers closed around the locket. Her eyes moved to her father, then back to Nia. Nia smiled. She did not push. She let the moment be what it was. I'll give you a few minutes to look at the menu, she said gently, beginning to rise. And then, a sound, small, barely there, barely a breath of a thing, but unmistakable. Stay. Tae-Min heard it before he understood what it was. The word was so small, so carefully released, like something held for a very long time finally being allowed into the air. Stay. A single syllable in a voice that was husky from long disuse, rough and soft at once, like the first note from a violin that hasn't been played in years. Nia went absolutely still. Tae-Min stopped breathing. Louissa sat with her hands around the locket and her eyes fixed on Nia with an expression of naked, unguarded hope that cracked something open in the room. Nia looked at her. A moment passed. Then Nia set down her tray on the edge of the booth, crouched down to Louissa's level, eye to eye, and said very softly and very steadily, as if she understood exactly what this cost. Of course I'll stay. The silence in the alcove was different now. It was not empty. It was full to the edges with something enormous and fragile and astonishing. Tae-Min pressed 2 fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose. Then he lowered his hand. His eyes were bright. He said nothing for a moment. Because there are some moments when words would only interrupt. Nia, still crouched, said to Louissa, My name is Nia. What's yours? Louissa looked at her for a long time. Then she pressed 2 fingers to her chest. Louissa? Tae-Min said gently. Can you tell Nia your name? The faintest hesitation. Then barely, Lou. Not Louissa. But a name. Her name. Offered like a small, careful gift. Nia received it like one. Lou, she said, and made it sound like something worth treasuring. That's a beautiful name. They sat for a while. Nia, understanding something wordlessly, or perhaps just being exactly the kind of person who understands without having to understand, settled cross-legged on the floor beside the booth and spoke softly with Louissa about the candle and the roses and what she had ordered to eat, while Louissa responded in her own language, nods and points, and once, a small smile so wide and so sudden it was like a window flung open. Tae-Min watched and he felt something shift in his chest. Not a breaking. The opposite, a very small, very careful thing beginning to close. The way a crack in the earth closes slowly after an earthquake is when the ground settles back into itself. When dinner was finished, pasta for Louissa, branzino for Tae-Min, the chocolate cake split between them because Nia had brought 2 forks without being asked. Nia helped Louissa back into her small coat with the gentle ease of someone who has done it 1,000 times. Louissa stood. Her hand went to Nia's sleeve and tugged, once gently. Nia looked at her. Louissa's lips moved. Her voice was barely there, barely enough to hear. But it was there. Come back. Tae-Min stood very still. Nia looked at Louissa for a long moment. Then she looked, for the first time really looked, at Tae-Min. And he looked back at her. And in that glance something passed between them that was too complicated and too new to name but was undeniably something. He cleared his throat softly. Said to Nia in the measured, quiet way he said everything, We would very much like to have you visit. If you would be willing. For Louissa. Pause. Then, with a small, genuine honesty that surprised even him, and perhaps for all of us. Nia stood there in her white shirt and paint-stained hand and soft, loosened curls, and she looked at him and she looked at Louissa. And she looked at the 2 of them together, this tall, careful, quietly devastated man and his small, luminous, brave little girl, and she said, Yes. She came on a Saturday morning and she brought her sketchbook. It was a large one, spiral-bound, the cover worn at the corners from being carried everywhere. She also brought a smaller one, new, its cover pale green, and a set of soft graphite pencils and a small tin of colored pencils that she set on the sunroom table with the air of someone laying out an offering. Louissa had been at the window when the car pulled up. Tae-Min had watched her from the doorway as she recognized Nia's figure getting out of the taxi, watched his daughter's whole posture change, subtle but unmistakable, a brightening, a leaning forward, both small hands pressing flat against the glass. "She's here," he said softly as if it needed saying. Louissa was already moving toward the stairs. Mrs. Yoon opened the door and Nia stepped into the Kwon house for the first time, and took it in with her artist's eyes, honestly, openly, without pretense. The soaring entry hall, the art on the walls, the grand piano standing quiet and gleaming in the living room, the wide staircase with its dark iron rail. "This house is extraordinary," she said simply. Tae-Min, coming down the stairs behind Louissa, said, "It's a little large for two people." Something in that sentence was honest enough that Nia glanced at him. He met her gaze briefly, then looked away toward his daughter. Louissa had stopped on the third stair from the bottom and was looking at Nia very seriously. In her hands she was holding a drawing, done this morning in the hour since breakfast, with her colored pencils and intense concentration. She held it out. Nia took it and looked at it. Her expression softened completely. It was a drawing of the restaurant, the candles, the roses, the booth. And at the center, in careful brown and yellow and green, two figures. A small one with large curls and a gold necklace, and a taller one with loose hair and a yellow smear on one hand. "Is that us?" Nia asked. Louissa's nod was emphatic. "Lou," Nia said, holding the drawing carefully, "this is one of the most beautiful drawings I've ever seen." Louissa looked down and her cheeks, brown and round and soft, went visibly warmer. She almost smiled. Then she did smile, just briefly, and turned and headed toward the sunroom in the wordless, purposeful way that meant "come with me." They spent the morning drawing. Nia had a gift for this, for the kind of quiet, side-by-side company that does not demand anything. She drew in her own sketchbook, working on a study of the garden visible through the sunroom's tall windows, and let Louissa do whatever she wanted in the green sketchbook. She did not hover. She did not evaluate. She simply drew beside Louissa with the easy absorption of someone who genuinely loves what they are doing, and occasionally Louissa would glance over and look at Nia's drawing, and Nia would tilt the sketchbook toward her so she could see better. Around 11 o'clock, Louissa pointed to something in Nia's drawing, the old oak tree in the garden's center, and made a sound that was almost a word. Nia waited. A stop. A breath. Tree. Nia looked at the tree, then at Louissa. "Yes," she said without ceremony, as if this were perfectly normal. "The oak tree. It's beautiful, isn't it? Very old, I think." Louissa nodded. She pointed at it again, then pointed to the window, then made a small fluttery motion with her hand. "Birds?" Nia guessed. An emphatic nod. She held up a single finger. "One bird." Louissa shook her head. Held up both hands. "All fingers. Many birds." Another emphatic nod and a tiny conspiratorial look that said, "This is our secret and it is very important." "Tell me more," Nia said and leaned in. Tae-Min brought tea around noon, not asked, simply appearing in the doorway with a tray, moving quietly, hesitant in a way that was new for him, as if aware he was entering something he did not want to disrupt. He set the tea on the low table beside them and looked at the sketchbooks spread across the floor, Louissa's careful drawings and Nia's looser, bolder ones, overlapping at the edges like two languages finding a common word. He sat down, not on the sofa but on the floor, a little apart, crossing his long legs and wrapping both hands around his own cup. Louissa noticed. She looked from him to Nia with an expression of pleased evaluation, as if she had been considering whether to allow this and had decided yes. She picked up a pencil and held it out to him. Tae-Min looked at it. "I don't draw, Lou." She continued to hold it out. Nia looked at him with a smile that was brief, warm, and slightly teasing. "I think that was a command." He took the pencil. He drew terribly, a house that looked like a box with a triangle on top, a tree that looked like a lollipop, and Louissa watched him with increasing delight until she covered her mouth with both hands and her whole small body shook with silent laughter. Nia laughed too. Openly, freely, a laugh that filled the room's corners with warm sound. Tae-Min looked at both of them, laughing at his drawing, and felt something so unfamiliar and so welcome that for a moment he couldn't identify it. Then he could. It was ordinary joy. The weeks that followed had their own slow rhythm. Nia came twice, then 3 times a week, adjusting her schedule around Louissa's school days and her own MFA classes and evening shifts at Lumina. She brought new sketchbooks, watercolors, and a small box of oil pastels. She and Louissa worked side by side through rainy afternoons and clear ones, building a visual language together, Nia teaching technique without calling it teaching, simply showing, demonstrating this is how you make the shadow, and Louissa absorbing it all with that ancient, watchful attention. Words came back slowly. The way spring comes, not in a sudden declaration but in increments, each one small enough to doubt until suddenly there are too many to ignore. See, nice, Nia. Then short phrases, look here and do this, and birds came back. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March when Nia was showing her how to mix blue and yellow into green, Louissa looked up and said in a voice that was growing steadier every week, "Did you know green is all the colors inside?" Nia went still for a half second. Then she said perfectly calmly, "I didn't know that. Is that true?" Mama said it. A quiet breath moved through the room. "She sounds like she was very wise," Nia said softly. Louissa looked down at the paint. Then she said, so quietly it was almost a thought, "She was nice. Like you." Nia set down her brush. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Lou. That is the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me." That evening, after Louissa had fallen asleep between them on the sofa, tucked against Nia's side with one small hand resting on Tae-Min's knee, the three of them having watched an animated film about a traveling bird that Louissa had silently but firmly selected from the streaming menu, Nia and Tae-Min sat in the lamplight of the living room and neither of them moved for a long time. Louissa's breathing was slow and even. Her curls had come half undone from their ribbons and spread across Nia's arm. Nia looked down at her. Then up at Tae-Min. He looked back. Outside, February had turned to March, and somewhere in the dark garden, the first tentative signs of the season were beginning. By April, Louissa spoke in sentences. Not always. Not to everyone. She remained selective and thoughtful in the way she chose to give her words. She would not speak to a large group, would not perform her returning voice for visitors or colleagues. But with Mrs. Yoon and with Tae-Min and with Nia, the words came more and more freely, like water that has found its level. She told Nia about her mother's garden in the memory of their old house, the one they had lived in when Amara was alive, before Tae-Min had moved them to the Gold Coast mansion that was larger and quieter, and somehow harder to fill. She described the garden in careful detail, the raised beds Amara had built from reclaimed wood, the strawberries they had grown and eaten straight from the plant, the old wind chime made of sea glass that Amara had brought back from a trip to Cape Coast before Louissa was born. Nia listened to all of it. She had a particular gift for listening, not the polite, surface listening of social obligation, but the real kind, the kind where you take what someone says and hold it carefully and let it matter. She painted, alongside these conversations. She was working on a series for her MFA thesis, paintings of domestic spaces and the emotional residue they hold, and she had, without entirely planning to, begun incorporating things from Louissa's descriptions. The sea glass wind chime. The raised garden beds. Small familiar objects rendered in luminous color. When she showed Louissa one of the canvases, Louissa stood in front of it for a long time. Then she said, "You painted the chime." "You told me about it," Nia said. It seemed too beautiful to leave out. Louissa turned and looked at her with the full weight of those enormous ancient eyes. "Can I have it?" she asked. "When it's done." "Yes," Nia said without hesitating. "It was always yours." Meanwhile, things were also slowly, quietly, and somewhat terrifyingly changing between Nia and Tae-Min. It happened in the in-between spaces, the marginal moments, the moments neither of them was braced for. The evenings after Louissa went to bed, when they would end up on the terrace with tea or wine, the city glittering beneath them in the clear spring dark. They would start with Louissa, how she'd been, what she'd said, something that had delighted or concerned them, and they would move from there gradually into other territories. He told her about his father, who had built the first Kwon International Gallery with nothing but Korean craftsmanship and an unshakable belief that beauty was a form of precision. About how he had learned to love art not in schools or galleries but in his father's warehouse, where crates of sculpture sat in careful rows waiting to become someone's most prized possession, and young Tae-Min had spent Saturday mornings climbing carefully between them, learning the specific patience of things made with care. She told him about her own beginning, not the polished version she gave in artist statements but the real one. Growing up in Detroit with a mother who painted watercolors on the kitchen table after the dishes were done. The partial scholarship to the School of the Art Institute that she had supplemented with every job she could take. The engagement that had ended 2 years ago was with a man who had been perfectly kind and perfectly wrong, who had said gently that he wasn't sure her art would go anywhere, meaning well she knew but landing it like a blade. The specific loneliness of a person who knows exactly what they love and is not yet certain the world has room for it. It does, Tae-Min said on the terrace very quietly. Have room for it. She looked at him. He was looking at the city. His profile in the terrace light was precise and still, that composed, closed face that she had been learning to read for weeks, learning the small variations that in another face might have been shouts but in his were whispers. The slight softening around the eyes. The almost imperceptible loosening of his jaw. How do you know? She asked. He turned to look at her. For a moment the full weight of his attention, that careful, complete, deep attention, rested on her and she felt it the way you feel the sun when you step out of shade. Because I've seen a great deal of art, he said. And I know the difference between what decorates a wall and what changes the room it hangs in. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her tea. And she was smiling. He watched her smile for a moment. Then he looked away back at the city, and his expression held something that on a less guarded face would have been called longing. Here it was simply stillness with a warmer quality than usual. Stillness with something beginning in it. The evenings multiplied. There was the evening she found him in the library reading Louissa's latest drawing, a complicated, multi-figure piece that had taken her 3 days, and holding it the same way he held significant documents, as if it contained essential information. Nia had leaned in the doorway and watched him without speaking, and he had eventually looked up and found her there, and something had passed across his face that was not composure. There was the afternoon he brought Nia a cup of coffee in the sunroom and lingered, standing by the window, asking about her thesis, asking about the paintings, listening with the focused precision he brought to everything he considered important. She had realized slowly that this was how he showed care, with attention, with inquiry, with the choice to stay in a room and ask another question. There was the Saturday morning when Louissa, fresh from the garden with muddy knees and a handful of early wildflowers, had deposited the flowers first into Nia's hands and then, turning, handed Tae-Min the one remaining dandelion, the last slightly sorry one, with the cheerful satisfaction of someone who has distributed gifts perfectly equitably. Nia and Tae-Min had looked at each other over Louissa's head, and both of them had smiled. April became May, and the Gold Coast garden became spectacular. The climbing roses on the iron fence bloomed at last, deep, extravagant pink, reaching skyward with complete conviction. The old oak tree opened its canopy wide, and the family of sparrows Louissa had been monitoring for weeks finally returned, exactly as she had predicted they would, choosing the same nest site with the loyal stubbornness of birds who know a good place when they find it. The beds along the south wall, which Mrs. Yoon had planted with bulbs in October, erupted into tulips, yellow, cream, red and one spectacular deep purple that Louissa called the king, and checked on every morning before school. Nia was in the garden on a Saturday afternoon in the second week of May, sketchbook open in her lap, working on a study of the rose-draped fence while Louissa dug industriously in one of the flower beds with a small trowel, looking for what she described as treasure, which had so far yielded 3 earthworms, 2 interesting pebbles, and half of a ceramic tile in a pattern Louissa found probably from a castle. Tae-Min sat on the garden bench nearby with his phone face down on the seat beside him, deliberately face down, which Nia had noticed was a thing he did now, on Saturdays, when he was choosing to be present instead of available. The afternoon was warm and clear with a slight breeze that moved through the garden with the gentle consideration of someone trying not to disturb anything. The roses nodded. The sparrows conducted their spirited argument in the oak tree. Louissa hummed to herself as she dug, and the sound of it, low and tuneless and completely unconscious, made both adults still for a moment in a private noticing. She was humming. Tae-Min met Nia's eyes across the garden. The expression on his face was difficult to describe. It was the face of a man who is experiencing something so large and so fragile that he cannot afford to react to it fully in the moment. Nia smiled at him. A slow, warm, telling smile. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he stood, and instead of going back inside or reaching for his phone, he walked across the garden to where Nia was sitting. He stopped at the bench beside hers. He looked at her sketchbook, the fence and roses rendered in quick, assured graphite lines, alive on the page. "May I?" he said. She passed it to him. He looked at it for a long time. Turned back a page and then another, through the studies of this garden she had been accumulating all spring. The oak tree. The tulip beds. Louissa from behind, small in a large garden, looking up at something out of frame. "These are extraordinary," he said. Not as a pleasantry. As a statement of observed fact, which was the only way he made assessments. "Thank you," she said. He handed the sketchbook back. But he did not move away. He stood there in the May afternoon light in his weekend clothes, dark trousers, a pale shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm, more undone than she had ever seen him, and looked out at the garden. "Nia," he said. The way he said her name, quietly, carefully, with the same precise attention he gave to everything he considered worth saying, made her put the sketchbook down. "Yes," she said. He looked at her then. And whatever composure he normally maintained like a habit, it was not quite in place in this moment. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something which was, she realized, quite brave for someone who did not often stand at edges. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I'm not certain I will say it well. But uncertain has become very familiar to me lately, and I have learned to proceed despite it." She waited. "When we first came to Lumina," he said, "I had reduced everything, to the single goal of helping Louissa. I wasn't thinking about anything else. I wasn't capable of thinking about anything else." Pause. "And then you walked in. And something happened that I didn't plan for and couldn't have anticipated." The breeze moved through the roses. Louissa, further down the garden, was describing her earthworm findings to herself in an ongoing quiet monologue. "You gave my daughter her voice back," Tae-Min said. "Not by trying. Not by technique. Just by being what you are. Which is someone who makes people feel entirely safe and entirely seen." He looked at her directly. "And somewhere in watching that happen, somewhere in the months of Saturdays and the evenings on the terrace and the terrible drawing I did and the way you laughed at it, I realized that you had done something to me too." Another pause. "Made me feel seen. For the first time in a very long time." Nia's hands were still in her lap. Her hazel eyes were bright with something carefully contained. "I am not good at this," he said. "I will not pretend to be good at this. I am a man who spent a long time behind glass, able to observe everything and feel rather less of it, and then grief arrived and taught me exactly how wrong that was, and now I feel a great deal and simply haven't always known what to do with it." He said very simply, "I don't want you to stop coming here. I don't want it to only be for Louissa, though it began that way and she is the most important thing in my life. I want a breath. I want you to stay. Not as a visitor. As Nia." Louissa's voice, bright and clear as a struck bell, rang across the garden. Both adults turned. She was standing by the flower bed, trowel in hand, muddy to the elbows, with a look of triumphant delight. "I found a crystal." In her outstretched palm, a piece of quartz, probably garden variety, catching the May afternoon light in enough facets to look undeniably like something magic. Nia was on her feet before she knew it, crossing the garden to crouch beside Louissa and examine the crystal with the full seriousness it deserved. "Lou," she breathed, "that is absolutely a crystal. That might be the most important thing anyone has found in this garden." Louissa beamed, the full, blazing, incandescent beam that made her look so extraordinarily like Amara. Then she looked past Nia at her father, who had followed and stood above them both, and she must have read something in the quality of the air between the two adults, or perhaps she simply felt it, the way perceptive small children often feel things before they understand them, because she looked from Nia to her father and back again with an expression of thorough 6-year-old satisfaction. Then she set down the crystal, threw both arms around Nia's neck and said, muffled into her shoulder, "Don't go away." And then, untangling herself and turning, she wrapped both arms around Tae-Min's leg and pressed her face against it, the gold locket swinging forward. He put his hand on her head, very gently. He looked at Nia over Louissa's curls. Nia looked back at him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. And it was answered to both of them. He reached out, slow, deliberate the way he did everything, and took her hand. His fingers closed around hers with the careful, wondering grip of a man holding something he had been afraid to reach for. They stood like that in the spring garden, the roses blooming and the sparrows arguing, and Louissa pressed between them, holding them both as if it were the most natural arrangement the world had ever produced. And perhaps it was. Summer arrived at the Gold Coast mansion and remade it entirely. This was the thing about the house that Tae-Min had almost forgotten. Living in it through 2 winters of grief, it was built for light. The tall windows caught the June mornings and scattered them in long warm rectangles across every floor. The garden went from spectacular to extravagant, roses at their absolute height, the oak tree in its full, magnificent canopy, the flower beds an orchestra of color. Mrs. Yoon opened the window she had kept closed all winter, and the house filled with the smell of cut grass and summer warmth and, on baking days, the particular sweetness of honey cake cooling on the kitchen counter. It was a different house. Not the structure. The bones were the same, the limestone, the iron rail, the grand piano in the living room. But the quality of the air inside it had changed, the way a room changes after it has been opened to the weather. Lighter, more inhabited, awake. Louissa talked now. Not non-stop, not in the unbounded torrent of a child who has never been interrupted by silence. She would always, Tae-Min suspected, carry something of that inward, watchful quality, and it was part of what made her who she was. But she talked. She told Mrs. Yoon detailed opinions about breakfast. She narrated her drawings as she made them, providing simultaneous commentary on both the art and the thought behind it. She had resumed at school, something approaching normal sociability. She had a best friend now, a girl named Rosie who collected rocks and who Louissa considered an ally of absolute reliability. And she talked to Nia. She talked to Nia the way she had once talked to Amara, with the full, trusting flood of a child who has decided that this person is safe for everything. Nia had her own studio now. Not a formal arrangement, not at first, but over the weeks following May, the sunroom had gradually reorganized itself around her presence. Her sketchbooks lined one shelf. Her oil pastels lived in a ceramic pot on the windowsill. The series of paintings she was completing for her MFA thesis stood along the wall in careful rows, and the largest of them, a wide, luminous canvas of a garden in late afternoon light, two figures barely suggested in the lower left corner, a child's small shape between them, had been selected by her department chair as the centerpiece of the spring exhibition. She was in her studio on a warm Saturday morning in July when Louissa appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, hair gloriously untamed, clutching the yellow fabric bunny she still slept with. "Mama Nia," she said. The world stopped. Nia turned from her canvas very slowly. Louissa was looking at her with those enormous, steady eyes, the locket resting against her pajama top, the bunny tucked under one arm. Her expression was entirely calm, the expression of someone who has said a thing they have been considering for some time and is satisfied that it was the right word. Mama Nia. Not Mama. She had only one Mama, and Louissa held that name with the sacred, irreplaceable certainty that it deserved. But Mama Nia. Two names joined together with a small conjunction of love, making room for both things to be true at once, that she had a mother she had lost and a woman she was choosing. Nia set down her brush. She crossed the room and knelt in front of Louissa and looked at her face, this extraordinary, brave, luminous face, and felt the full weight of what it means to be trusted by a child who knows exactly what trust costs. "Hi Lou," she said softly. Louissa held out the bunny. "An offering. Or perhaps, evidence. Here is the most important thing I have. Here is what I am giving into your keeping." Nia took the bunny carefully. "Thank you," she said. Louissa nodded, satisfied, and climbed into her lap. Tae-Min found them like that 20 minutes later, Nia sitting against the sunroom wall with Louissa asleep in her arms again, the bunny between them, the morning light falling in long warm angles across both of them. He stood in the doorway for a moment and let himself simply look. He was a man who had learned, over 2 very hard years, that the right response to beauty is not to control it or contain it or try to hold it permanently still. It is to witness it, fully, gratefully, without bracing for the moment it might end. He came into the room. He sat beside her on the floor. Louissa shifted in her sleep and pressed one small foot against his knee without waking. "She called you Mama Nia," he said quietly. "Yes," Nia said. A silence. "How do you feel about that?" he asked. Nia looked down at Louissa, then at him. Her hazel eyes were warm and honest and completely without performance. "I feel," she said, "like the word fits." He reached over in the morning light and tucked a loose curl behind her ear. His fingers rested for a moment at her jaw, that careful, unhurried touch of a man who does not make any movement without meaning it. "I've been speaking to the Art Institute," he said. "They have a residency program. I spoke with the director. Your thesis series, the garden paintings, she would very much like to see them. Pause. If you would like me to arrange a meeting." She turned to look at him fully. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She covered his hand briefly with hers. Then she looked back at Louissa, sleeping and entire in the morning light. "What does the future look like to you?" she asked. Not anxiously. With the open, quiet curiosity of someone who is genuinely ready to hear the answer. He thought for a moment. The careful, deliberate, unrushed thinking of a man who considers words before releasing them. "Louder," he said. "It looks considerably louder than it did a year ago." He glanced at her. "Warmer. More paint-stained." She laughed softly. Louissa stirred and settled. "I think," he said, "it looks like this garden in high summer. A great deal is going on. A certain amount of chaos. Mrs. Yoon is very concerned about the tulips. Pause. But fundamentally, he stopped. Tried again. Fundamentally, it looks like the three of us are in it. She was quiet for a moment. Tae-Min, she said. Yes. I've spent 2 years being afraid that what I love, the painting, the teaching, the way I want to move through the world, wouldn't fit inside someone else's life. That there wouldn't be room. She looked at him steadily. I'm not afraid of that here. No, he said. There is a great deal of room. They sat in the sunroom as the morning completed itself, the light moving in the garden just beyond the glass going about its magnificent June business, the sparrows returning from wherever they go on Saturday mornings, the roses nodding at the fence in some private agreement with the breeze. And presently Louissa opened her eyes. She looked up at Nia. Then turned and looked at Tae-Min. Took in the fact of both of them there, close in the warm room in the unhurried morning. She held up the locket. Tae-Min reached over and helped her open it, the tiny clasp, the small interior, the photograph of Amara laughing with her head thrown back. Louissa looked at it for a moment. Then very carefully she clicked it closed. She looked at Nia. Mama says, Louissa said slowly with the gravity of a child delivering a message they have held for a long time, that happiness is the bravest thing. Both adults were very still. Then Nia said gently, she's right. Louissa nodded. Stretch. Picked up the yellow bunny from the floor with the brisk executive air of a child who has accomplished something important and is now ready to move on to breakfast. Mrs. Yoon is making pancakes, she said matter-of-factly. With the blueberries. We should go. She walked to the door and then turned and gave them both the look, patient, imperious, fond, that said, are you coming or not? Tae-Min rose. He held out his hand to Nia. She took it. They walked to the kitchen together, their daughter leading the way. And if you had stood outside the Gold Coast mansion that July morning and looked up at the warm limestone and the blooming roses and the iron fence strung with life, you might have heard, drifting out through an open window on the second floor, carried on the summer morning like a gift from a world learning to be glad again, the sound of a small girl chatting at speed about the relative merits of blueberry versus strawberry pancakes, and a woman laughing and a man saying something in a low, warm voice that made the woman laugh again, and then Louissa saying Baba, that's not even funny, and then 3 different varieties of laughter tangled up together and let loose into the warm July air. 3 hearts. 1 word. Stay. And everything that bloomed from it.